David was a quiet man living in a small town. He had a good job and a comfortable life, but something was missing. David always felt a little embarrassed when he tried to speak English. He knew some words and could understand a few sentences, but he wasn't fluent. He often wished he could speak English more easily, especially when he met people from other countries. One day, David made a big decision. He decided to go to London, the capital of England, to improve his English. If I want to be fluent, I need to immerse myself in the language, he thought. London was a city full of opportunities, and David believed that living there would help him become a better English speaker. David started to prepare for his journey. He saved money, applied for a visa, and looked for a place to stay in London. He was excited, but also a little nervous. What if people couldn't understand him? What if he made mistakes? These thoughts made David worry, but he didn't let them stop him. He knew that this was the best way to improve his English. As the day of his departure approached, David felt a mix of emotions. He was leaving his comfortable life behind to face new challenges in a foreign country. But he was determined. He packed his bags, said goodbye to his family and friends, and boarded the plane to London. David didn't know what the future would hold, but he was ready to face it with courage and determination. When David's plane landed in London, he felt a mix of excitement and fear. The airport was huge, and people were moving quickly in every direction. As he walked through the terminal, he could hear the sound of English all around him. Some voices were clear and easy to understand, but others spoke so fast that the words seemed to blur together. David approached the customs officer with a smile, hoping it would make the process easier. "Hello," he said, handing over his passport. The officer looked at him and asked a question. David caught a few words but couldn't understand everything. His heart began to race. He tried to guess what the officer meant and replied, "I'm here for a holiday." The officer frowned slightly, and David worried he had said the wrong thing. But after a few more questions, the officer stamped his passport and let him through. David breathed a sigh of relief as he moved towards the exit. His first conversation in London had been more difficult than he expected. Outside the airport, David hailed a taxi to take him to his hotel. The driver asked where he wanted to go. David hesitated, trying to remember the address. When he finally spoke, the words came out slowly and awkwardly. The driver nodded, but seemed a bit impatient. As they drove through the city, David looked out the window at the busy streets and tall buildings. London was even bigger and more impressive than he had imagined. At the hotel, the receptionist welcomed David with a friendly smile. She spoke quickly, asking for his details. David struggled to keep up with the conversation. He had to ask her to repeat herself several times, which made him feel embarrassed. Finally, he got the key to his room and headed upstairs. The day had been exhausting, and David felt overwhelmed by the challenges of communicating in English. Later that evening, David decided to explore the neighborhood around his hotel. He walked into a small cafe and tried to order a coffee, but when the barista asked him a question, he didn't understand. David smiled nervously and pointed at the menu, hoping that would help. The barista eventually figured out what he wanted, but David felt frustrated. He realized that simple tasks like ordering food or asking for directions were much harder than he had expected. As David returned to his hotel that night, he couldn't help but feel a bit discouraged. London was exciting, but the language barrier was more difficult to overcome than he had imagined. However, deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. He had come to London to learn, and he wasn't going to give up so easily. The next few days in London were tough for David. Every morning, he would step out of his hotel, determined to practice his English and explore the city. But each day brought new challenges. David soon realized that understanding English was only half the battle. Speaking it confidently was even harder. Whenever he tried to talk to someone, he found himself struggling to find the right words. Sometimes he would mix up his sentences, and people would give him puzzled looks. This made him feel embarrassed, and he often wished he could just avoid talking altogether. One morning, David decided to visit a local market. The market was full of life, with vendors shouting out their prices and customers bargaining for the best deals. David wanted to buy some fresh fruit, but when he tried to ask for the price, the vendor replied so quickly that David couldn't understand a word. He ended up just pointing at the fruit and handing over some money, hoping it was enough. The vendor gave him a strange look, but accepted the money. Later that day, David had another difficult experience. He went to a museum, excited to learn more about British history. As he walked through the exhibits, he noticed a group of tourists listening to a guide. David decided to join the group, hoping to learn something new. But as the guide spoke, David found it hard to keep up. The guide's accent was different from what he was used to, and he spoke in long, complex sentences. David felt lost and left the tour early, feeling disappointed. David's biggest challenge came when he attended a social event organized by his language school. It was a chance to meet other students and practice speaking English in a relaxed environment. At first, David felt hopeful, but as he tried to join conversations, he quickly realized that most people spoke much better English than he did. They used words he didn't know and spoke with ease. David felt out of place and struggled to keep the conversation going. He could see the others getting bored, and eventually, they drifted away to talk to someone else. That night, back in his hotel room, David felt discouraged. He knew he had made mistakes, and he couldn't help but feel like he wasn't improving at all. The challenges of speaking English in London were harder than he had expected, and he wondered if he had made the right decision to come here. But even in his frustration, David reminded himself of his goal. He had come to London to learn, and he wasn't going to give up now. Every mistake is a step forward, he told himself. I'll keep trying until I get it right. After a tough start in London, David realized he needed help if he was going to improve his English. He knew that learning on his own wasn't enough, so he decided to find ways to practice more effectively. One day, while browsing the internet, David came across an advertisement for an English conversation group. The group met every week at a local cafe, and it was open to anyone who wanted to practice speaking English. David thought it sounded perfect. He signed up and decided to attend the next meeting. When David arrived at the cafe, he was nervous. He didn't know what to expect, but as soon as he walked in, he was greeted by friendly faces. The group leader, a cheerful woman named Emma, welcomed David and introduced him to the others. There were people from all over the world, each with their own story and reason for learning English. David felt a bit more comfortable knowing he wasn't alone in his struggles. The conversation group was just what David needed. Each week, they would discuss different topics, from travel and culture to daily life in London. At first, David found it difficult to keep up, but as the weeks passed, he started to notice small improvements. He was able to follow the conversations more easily, and his confidence grew as he practiced speaking in a supportive environment. In addition to the conversation group, David also decided to join a language class. The class focused on grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation, helping David build a stronger foundation in English. The teacher was patient and understanding, always encouraging the students to ask questions and practice speaking. Outside of the group and the class, David began to adopt new learning strategies. He started watching English TV shows and movies with subtitles, which helped him get used to different accents and speaking styles. He also listened to podcasts and audiobooks during his daily walks around the city. This constant exposure to English helped David pick up new phrases and expressions that he could use in conversations. David also made a habit of reading English books and newspapers. He started with simple books and articles, gradually moving on to more complex texts as his reading skills improved. Whenever he came across a word he didn't know, he would look it up and write it down in a notebook. Over time, his vocabulary grew, and he found himself understanding more and more of what he read and heard. As David continued to practice, he began to notice significant changes in his English skills. He was able to express himself more clearly and fluently. He no longer felt as nervous when speaking to others, and he even started to enjoy the challenge of using English in new situations. The support from his friends in the conversation group, along with his own dedication to learning, was making a real difference. David knew he still had a long way to go, but he was no longer afraid of making mistakes. He had learned that every challenge was an opportunity to improve, and he was determined to keep going until he reached his goal. As the weeks turned into months, David's hard work began to pay off. He noticed that his English was improving in small but significant ways. These changes gave him the confidence to push himself further and take on new challenges. One day, David had his first major breakthrough. He was at a business meeting with colleagues from different countries, and the meeting was conducted entirely in English. Normally, David would have felt nervous and struggled to keep up, but this time was different. As the meeting progressed, David found himself following the discussion with ease. When it was his turn to speak, he did so confidently and clearly. His words flowed naturally, and he was able to express his ideas without hesitation. After the meeting, one of his colleagues even complimented him on his English, which filled David with pride. Another breakthrough came when David was invited to a friend's dinner party. The event was informal, and the guests were from various parts of the world. As they sat around the table, the conversation shifted from one topic to another, with everyone sharing stories and opinions. In the past, David would have struggled to join in, but this time he was able to participate fully. He told a few stories of his own, using phrases and expressions he had learned from his conversation group and language class. The guests laughed and engaged with him, and for the first time, David felt like he truly belonged in the conversation. David's most rewarding breakthrough happened when he visited a local bookstore. He had been practicing his reading skills, and on this particular day, he decided to buy a novel written in English. It was a book he had always wanted to read, but he had been too intimidated by the language to try. With newfound confidence, David bought the book and started reading it that evening. At first, he had to look up a few words, but as he continued, he found that he could understand most of the story. He was so absorbed in the book that he read for hours without noticing the time pass. These moments of success showed David how far he had come. Each achievement, no matter how small, was a sign that his efforts were paying off. The challenges that had once seemed so daunting now felt like stepping stones towards his goal. David no longer feared speaking English. Instead, he embraced every opportunity to use the language and learn from his experiences. As his confidence grew, David began to take on more ambitious projects. He started giving presentations at work in English, something he would have never dared to do before. He also began writing emails and reports in English, improving his written communication skills. Each new task he completed added to his sense of accomplishment and motivated him to keep going. David's journey was far from over, but these breakthrough moments reminded him that he was on the right path. He had overcome many of the obstacles that had once held him back, and he was excited to see where his journey would take him next. David's journey in London had been full of challenges, but with each obstacle he overcame, he became stronger and more confident. The more he practiced, the more fluent his English became. Over time, he found that speaking, listening, reading, and writing in English came naturally to him. He no longer had to think twice before forming a sentence or worry about making mistakes. His hard work was paying off. One day, David received an exciting opportunity at work. His company asked him to lead a project that required close collaboration with international partners. The role would involve many meetings, presentations, and written reports, all in English. A year ago, David would have been terrified by the idea, but now he felt ready. He accepted the challenge with enthusiasm. As the project progressed, David realized just how much his English had improved. He was able to communicate his ideas clearly and effectively, and he was comfortable leading discussions with his colleagues from different countries. His confidence in his language skills allowed him to focus on the content of the project rather than worrying about his English. The project was a success, and David's performance earned him praise from his supervisors. Outside of work, David continued to immerse himself in the English language. He made friends with native English speakers and regularly met up with them to practice speaking. He also continued to attend his conversation group and language class, where he was now one of the most confident participants. His classmates often asked him for advice on how to improve their own English, and David was happy to share the tips and techniques that had worked for him. David's fluency in English opened up new opportunities in his personal life as well. He was now able to fully enjoy the rich cultural experiences London had to offer. He attended theater performances, watched films without subtitles, and read English literature with ease. He even started to enjoy writing in English, something that had once been a source of frustration. David began keeping a journal in English, recording his thoughts and experiences in the language he had worked so hard to master. As David reflected on his journey, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He remembered the struggles he had faced when he first arrived in London, the misunderstandings, the frustrations, and the moments of doubt. But he also remembered the small victories, the breakthroughs, and the support he had received along the way. Every step, no matter how difficult, had brought him closer to his goal. One evening, David sat down to write a letter to his family back home. In the letter, he described how much his life had changed since he arrived in London. He wrote about the challenges he had faced and the progress he had made. Most importantly, he wrote about the sense of pride he felt in achieving fluency in English, a goal that had once seemed out of reach. David knew that his journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn and more ways to improve. But he was no longer afraid of the challenges that lay ahead. He had proven to himself that with determination, practice, and the right mindset, anything was possible. As he finished the letter, David felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had achieved what he had set out to do, and he was ready for whatever came next.